Belief in God, the natural and the supernatural. How should we read Scripture? For us today, whose knowledge of God is blocked by a mountain of worldly knowledge, there can be no unmediated engagement with the Gospels that doesn't misrepresent their message through our very reading of them. This is because when we read anything written in ancient times, we understand what we're reading in terms of our modern understanding of reality. And this understanding reflexively excludes any appeal to a supernatural to explain things. Modernity isn't just a name for our advanced stage of scientific and technological development, but is an inherently naturalistic worldview that commands our faith in the universality of the natural order. We moderns so typically believe that everything we experience can be explained naturally, that any departure from this is seen either as a sign of naive credulousness or regarded as perverse. This doesn't necessarily rule out the existence of a supernatural, but it does strongly bind it to the natural, placing it above nature and generally keeping it there. This means that moderns will always see miracles and other reported supernatural phenomena as extraordinary, rare, and limited intrusions into the far greater miracle that is the natural world, never as alternative norms that would undermine it. The default attitude of modernity towards the miraculous dimension of the gospel stories is therefore one of an extreme skepticism and disbelief that parallels the skepticism of the Jewish religious authorities, which were steeped in the vital importance of the law, or Torah, understood as the ordering principle that was key to all created existence. Behind Jewish skepticism of the Jesus movement's messianic claims was, I think, the political aspect of Jewish religious authority, which emphasized the mandatory character of the codified law. It wasn't that the authorities didn't understand the need of Jews to grasp the living meaning of the law behind the letter of it, but that for all those Jews who didn't fully grasp this meaning, the letter of the law was all that remained for them. And its observance was a political and social necessity. Jesus, like a Tibetan Buddhist crazy wisdom guru, often openly and deliberately flouted the letter of the law to teach people its dangers and limitations. Had he just done this privately in the company of his disciples, the authorities could have treated him as just another Jewish mystic or a Kabbalist before that designation had been coined. But the movement around him had become popular and volatile, run through with a messianic fervour that the authorities, as we can see from how events unfolded at that time, rightly divined Jesus would not be able to control. Today we might call such a movement populist, to deliberately invoke that term's current deploring of uncredentialed demagogues influencing areas of public life normally governed by established elites. The role of the Jews' religious elites was a deadly serious one, entrusted to them by 2,000 or 3,000 years of tradition, and which the survival of their society and culture depended on. Popular Jewish messianism was especially dangerous under Roman occupation. And only 30 or so years after Jesus' death, the second Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans in response to it. We should always keep this in mind when considering why Both the Jewish authorities and popular Jewish messianism rejected Jesus. The chief reasons were almost certainly political. Whether he intended to be or not, Jesus was a dangerous figure in an extremely dangerous situation. Returning to Christianity's rejection by the modern world, we must recognize the fact that our modern faith in science doesn't just explain things empirically, but has become a faith in itself that, in anticipating how we ought to experience things, actually causes us to experience them in that way. Which is to say, as if we were detached observers of life with only hypothetical knowledge of it, rather than being fully immersed participants in life who know it immediately. When the scientific worldview has absolutized itself in this way, which is to say has donned a godlike mantle that allows no room for any other absolute, then like all absolutisms, it can only be sustained by faith. This faith, however, is very different to the Christian faith, which preceded it. For where true Christian faith rests on actual knowledge of God, absolutized scientific faith rests on the belief that there is no supernatural dimension above the natural one, and that therefore there can be no knowledge of one. Knowledge of God here is hence discounted a priori as illusory, and not allowed any empirical value. Thus the disciples of absolutized science will only see God when they believe they can, which ironically is a reversal of the scientific method that disqualifies them as scientists in this capacity. Their problem now is philosophical, and it affects the vast majority in today's world. The church can't hope to convert that majority unless it confronts their philosophical assumptions philosophically, which the fathers of the church did in the early centuries of her formation with respect to Greek philosophy, Roman ethics, and surviving pagan systems of belief. The church has the resources to do this again today, but they'll be of no consequence unless Christians first familiarize themselves with them before using them. In order to know the world of the Gospels, we must mentally and emotionally extricate ourselves from today's world in order to immerse ourselves in the world that the characters of the Gospels lived in, and then mentally and emotionally re-extricate ourselves back out of it again in order to return to the present. It's necessary to imaginatively engage with the church's scriptures and traditions to enable this transposition. Through their mediation, they allow today's world to remember the world of the Bible and thereby enter into it, which is also what the Christian New Testament tries to do in respect of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament. To be specific, what need mediating now are the assumptions, prejudices, and presuppositions of both today's world and that of the Bible, which have no place in each other's domains. Then the Bible's eternal truths can shed light on our present world unhindered by its current level of development. This is the continuing task of every age, and it's always urgent and vitally important. Christianity teaches that in distinguishing those truths which are eternal from those which are only historical and transient, we are guided by the Spirit of our Creator. Today, especially in Western Europe, We live in a world largely freed by the struggles of former generations from what they conclusively determined were superstitious religious beliefs, and from the terrible violence that so often grew out of them. Thanks to this, most people now no longer act out of anxieties and ignorance endemic to lives lived in narrow, overtly religious frameworks in which God's mysterious creative power was routinely invoked to explain the gaps in people's practical understanding of the world. Today, science has filled those gaps far beyond people's of former ages' wildest dreams, a task too commonly obstructed by Christians in the past, fearing human transgression of God's divine prerogatives and the effecting of his increasing redundancy in the modern mind that would inevitably weaken religious observance. They were wrong to obstruct this, but correct in what they feared, given their obstructiveness, which held back Christianity's adaptation to the circumstances of modernity, depriving millions of modern people of access to Christ. People today, for example, do not typically literally fear eternal damnation in the fires of hell. Such fear is mostly seen now as being either an expression of fanatical and essentially sentimental attachment to our superstitious past, something to be overcome through the power of reason and scientific knowledge, or the imaginative symbolic expression of people's agonizing subjective states of alienation from nature, their own natures, and God. These imaginative symbolic expressions, if not viewed merely as dysfunctional psychic noise and treated with medication, are today read psychoanalytically in the hope of uncovering the underlying personal conflicts that give rise to them. There exists a wealth of literature outlining the different analytical approaches to carrying out this task. In general, people's mental health is understood today as being very much dependent on their mastery of their fears and anxieties through their use of and trust in reason. Preaching Jesus' good news of the closeness of the kingdom of heaven has therefore been perceived by the great majority of modern people as tending to undermine the power of reason and science by asking them to regress back to the fearful and gullible superstitious mindset that modernity long ago discredited. Even worse is the reception of proclamations of Jesus' death for us on the cross, which assume a guilt on our parts so grievous as to require an atonement far greater than we ourselves could ever offer, if indeed one were actually required by God, which modernity has actually questioned and answered in the negative. Far from offering hope to non-believers or inspiring them to welcome belief in Jesus, this approach tends to cause annoyance, if not outright anger, and reinforces their reasons for having given up on Christianity in the first place. The most important of these was probably precisely the unacceptability of this assumption of universal guilt associated with the corruption of human nature from the beginning by our most distant ancestor, Adam. It was this sense of guilt and people's belief that only following Jesus could save them from its consequences that drove Christian societies to condemn unbelievers and heretics, firstly to complete exclusion and later to the unspeakably cruel punishments and tortures that now in their turn are rightly condemned by modernity. No moderns are going to knowingly return to this mindset. To win over modern minds, Christianity itself has no choice but to embrace modernity and reappraise all of its established beliefs and doctrines in the light of it, something which is not at all unbiblical, since in the Bible human reason is God's greatest creation, which we are obviously expected to use. Probably the most intractable difference between the modern and pre-modern Christian minds is this difference in how alienation from God is perceived. The pre-modern Christian mind tries to read the Bible almost exclusively literally, believing that if things didn't literally happen just as described, then they didn't really happen at all, and the accounts of them can only be fictitious and essentially futile. The modern mind, in contrast, recognizes many different types of narrative in the Bible, some literal and historical, others poetic and celebratory, and yet others profoundly symbolic, psychological and philosophical. How they are perceived in this respect determines how the modern person understands their meanings, and ultimately it's their transcendent, metaphysical significance that matters. The essence of my argument here has been that God is immediately knowable to us through his immediate act of holding the entire universe, including ourselves, in existence. And that knowledge of his personal being is no more mysterious or opaque to us than knowing our own personal being, since ours is an emanation of his and retains its mysterious, immaterial, personal essence. We know our own mysterious persons through the actions that we initiate, and we can know God through them too, since we are just him incarnating as us. This is immediate knowledge of God through a reorientation of our worldly self that transcends our worldliness by transforming it into obedience to our Creator and his laws of creation. When we, sons and daughters of God, recognize our prodigality in that very moment, we remember the reality of God's presence to us and recognize him as our Father, not just as our essence or spirit, which is how the world's dualistic spiritual traditions see it, but as our body and blood, which revelation is epitomized in the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist.